Hey folks, tonight we're heading somewhere shadowed in secrecy and sharpened by history's harshest winds. Imagine a land where time itself seems frozen, caught between skyscrapers and rice paddies, military parades and midnight blackouts. A country whose headlines arrive only when rockets fly or leaders wave from balconies with cold smiles. Welcome to North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom, the land of contradictions and the stage for one of the most intense political dramas of the 20th and 21st centuries. Before we enter that world, go ahead, drop your location and local time in the comments. We're global travelers tonight. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with missiles or monuments, but with marching boots and colonial chains. In 1910, Korea became a colony of the Japanese Empire. For the next 35 years, the Korean people were stripped of their language, identity, and land. Japan sought to erase Korean culture, replacing it with emperor worship, forced labor, and military conscription. Streets once filled with marketplaces and music now echoed with Japanese commands. Koreans were not just second-class citizens, they were prisoners in their own homeland. Amidst this suppression, resistance brewed. Korean nationalists and communists, often overlapping, fled northward, organizing guerrilla bands. They operated in the frigid forests of Manchuria and the rugged hills near the Chinese border, launching raids and enduring brutal counterattacks. These rebels weren't always united. Factionalism was a nasty habit, but they shared one mission: end the occupation. Among these fighters rose a boy with sharp features and a steel stare, Kim Il-sung. His early years were filled with hardship. Born in 1912 near Pyongyang, Kim's family fled Japanese rule, settling in Manchuria. As a teenager, he joined anti-Japanese militias. By his 20s, he was commanding a small band of guerrillas, dodging patrols, hiding in snow-covered caves, and attacking rail lines. His most famous exploit? A 1937 raid on the Japanese outpost in Pakonbo, a daring strike that made his name echo through rebel circles. Though modest in scale, this raid became legendary, thanks in part to Soviet and later North Korean myth-making. Kim, we're told, single-handedly liberated the village, inspired the people, and vanished into the mist like a Korean Robin Hood. Truth? Probably less glamorous, but it worked. The myth had begun. By the 1940s, the tides of war turned. Japan, stretched thin in World War II, weakened its grip on Korea. Meanwhile, Kim and many fellow partisans found themselves in the Soviet Union, retraining and regrouping under Soviet protection. Stalin saw promise in this young Korean, and when Japan surrendered in 1945, the Soviets swept into northern Korea, bringing Kim back with them. Here's where the modern story splits. The Americans took the South, the Soviets held the North. Korea, a single nation for centuries, was abruptly sliced in half at the 38th parallel, an arbitrary line decided in Washington in mere minutes. Families were separated overnight, cities split, and the seeds of war were sown. The Soviets needed a loyal Korean face to front their new administration in the North. Enter Kim Il-sung, now a polished Soviet officer, fluent in Marxist theory and martial discipline. He was installed as the head of the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea, effectively the Soviet-approved ruler. And oh, did he look the part: youthful, confident, and surprisingly good at political chess. In contrast, the South saw U.S. military occupation, followed by the establishment of the Republic of Korea in 1948, with the staunchly anti-communist Syngman Rhee as president. The two Koreas, like fire and ice, began to harden in opposition. Back in Pyongyang, Kim consolidated power with precision. With Soviet backing, he formed the Korean Workers' Party, crushed rival factions including Southern Communists and Chinese-influenced leftists, and built a regime rooted in loyalty, ideology, and central control. By September 1948, he declared the birth of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, styling himself as premier. The title would change, but the grip wouldn't. What followed were sweeping reforms. Landowners lost everything. Overnight land was confiscated and redistributed to poor farmers. Factories and banks were nationalized. Education was overhauled. Religion, viewed with suspicion, was curtailed. A new society was being forged, hammered from steel, fed by slogans, and watched by secret police. But under all the parades and posters, anxiety pulsed. The division of Korea was never meant to be permanent. Both North and South claimed to be the true government of all Korea. And Kim? He wasn't content with half a country. He wanted it all. Before we reach that boiling point, one small aside. Imagine building a new state from scratch, while half your population whispers in the night that they preferred your rivals. No pressure, right? But Kim didn't just endure. He thrived. At least for now. By 1949, Soviet forces withdrew, confident that their pupil was in full control. But control, as we'll see, is always more fragile than it looks. And so we end this first step into North Korea's deep and often surreal journey. A nation born not just from revolution, but from division cleaved by empires, raised by ideologies, and led by a man who believed history had chosen him. Cold mist still clung to the forest floor when Kim Il-sung slipped through the pines in Manchuria, a shadow among shadows. Remember that daring Passchendaele raid I mentioned? Tonight, let's step closer into the life of the man behind the myth. From those snow-dusted hills, he would rise like a winter blossom tuft, unyielding and impossible to ignore. After 1937, Kim's legend spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. Tales spoke of him single-handedly toppling Japanese outposts, though in reality, he commanded a small guerrilla band and relied on local sympathizers. Propaganda would later inflate these exploits, painting him as Korea's liberator-in-chief. But even without the cinematic embellishments, young Kim was no ordinary freedom fighter. He had an uncanny knack for reading enemy patrol patterns, plus a stubborn persistence that bordered on obsession. Picture a determined toddler refusing to let go of an ice cream cone, except instead of ice cream, it was the fate of a nation. By the early 1940s, the Japanese dragnet tightened. Many guerrillas fell, some under torturous interrogation, others vanishing into the frozen wilderness. Kim knew his luck could run out. So, under cover of darkness in 1941, he slipped across the border into the Soviet Union. There, in remote camps near Khabarovsk, he and fellow Korean exiles underwent rigorous training, Marxist theory by day, weapons drills by night. It was a far cry from the rice paddies and village markets of home. But adversity was fast becoming Kim's best teacher. In those Soviet barracks, he met men who would become lifelong allies and rivals. Factionalism, it seemed, followed communists as reliably as winter frost. Some Koreans aligned with Chinese communists. Others eyed loyalty to Moscow above all. Kim, however, played both sides deftly. He learned Russian fluently, earned Soviet decorations, and displayed an eagerness to advance the communist cause. It was a savvy move. In Stalin's eyes, competence and unquestioning loyalty were prized above all. World War II was drawing to a close, and Japan's hold on Korea was slipping like wet fabric off a table. In August 1945, Soviet forces flooded across the Yalu River, chasing the retreating Japanese army. And with them came Kim Il-sung, the guerrilla turned Soviet officer who had proven his worth. He stepped onto Korean soil not as a ragtag rebel, but as a man stamped with Soviet approval. Meanwhile, far to the south, American troops landed in Incheon. In just weeks, two opposing occupations crystallized. The 38th parallel, an arbitrary line drawn on a map, split Korea in half, as if an unseen hand had cleaved it. Families were bisected, farms divided, and cities like Kaesong stranded in no man's land. The air crackled with tension But Kim saw opportunity. He sensed that history had handed him a blank canvas and a paintbrush dripping with possibility. Back in Pyongyang, he moved quickly. In October 1945, he was named chairman of the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea. The title was clunky, bureaucratic even, but the power behind it was immense. With Soviet tanks patrolling the streets, Kim wasted no time. Land reforms rolled out within months. Landlords had their holdings seized, while landless peasants received parcels in small ceremonies that felt more like political theater than gratitude. The once standoffish rural folk learned quickly. Bow your head to Kim's agents, or risk another voluntary education session. Factories, banks, and railways were next. Under the Soviet model, industries were nationalized overnight. Workers who had felt powerless under Japanese rule now found new bosses, Soviet advisors, and Korean cadres loyal to Kim. The party line emphasized modernization. Heavy industry first, consumer goods, if they ever arrived, sometime later. It was like expecting a five-star feast, but getting cold gruel with a side of slogans. Yet for many, merely being part of a new nation felt like hope. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. South Korean communists, who had fought for liberation in their own way, watched Kim's ascent with suspicion. They accused him of being a Soviet puppet, of selling out to Moscow's interests. Kim, ever the tactician, answered with purges. Rival factions, whether pro-Chinese, pro-Soviet, or simply too independent, found themselves stripped of rank, exiled, or worse. In whispered rumors, one heard of midnight arrests and long, silent trains steaming north to unknown destinations. It was never explicit in the propaganda posters. Those always showed smiling workers under Kim's guiding finger. But the message was clear. Loyalty wasn't optional. By the time the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formally declared in September 1948, Kim Il-sung was no longer just a decorated guerrilla leader. He was supreme leader, the father figure of a new state. Parades filled Pyongyang's grand squares. Banners proclaimed, "Long live President Kim," and school children memorized his speeches like prayers. In those early years, the personality cult was still taking shape, gentle reminders to hang his portrait alongside Marx, Lenin, and Stalin in every schoolroom. But underlying it all was a simple truth. Kim had become the story North Koreans told themselves about themselves. Despite the outward confidence, the young state teetered. The South, under Syngman Rhee's fiercely anti-communist government, consolidated its own power with American backing. Skirmishes along the 38th parallel became daily occurrences: sniper fire, artillery duels, loudspeakers blaring propaganda across minefields. Each side tested the other like boxers jabbing gloves, looking for a weakness. Supplies in the north were thin, but the spirit of revolution can be a powerful fuel when material comforts are scarce. In private moments, Kim must have known that the division of Korea was neither natural nor permanent. The question wasn't if the peninsula would reunite, but how and under whose terms. For now, he focused on cementing his hold, building an ideology that placed him at the very center, ensuring that any challenge would feel like treason against the nation itself. Later memoirs would claim he walked Pyongyang streets at dawn, mingling with citizens incognito to hear rumors and complaints. Maybe it happened. Maybe it was another brushstroke in the emerging masterpiece of his legend. Either way, the effect was the same. North Koreans began to sense that their leader was omnipresent, even if they never saw him in person. And when you're constructing a society where fear and devotion intertwine like barbed wire, the illusion of ubiquity can be as potent as the real thing. So from guerrilla camps in Manchuria to the grand halls of Pyongyang's government buildings, Kim Il-sung's journey was a testament to ambition and adaptation. He transformed from a ragged rebel into the architect of a state, with all the contradictions that implied compassion for his people on one hand, ruthless suppression on the other. It was a balancing act worthy of a circus tightrope. Though one slip could and would cost dearly. And yet, for all the iron-fisted tactics, there lingered a human curiosity in Kim's early days. He invited Soviet experts to teach engineers, allowed artists to study abroad, and once even joked quietly that if the rice harvest failed, at least they had plenty of slogans. That lightness would fade in later decades, but tonight we glimpse the man before the myth. A man molded by war, forged in ideology, and determined to leave his mark on history. Next, we'll delve into how this guerrilla leader, now premier, founded the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and reshaped the land torn between two superpowers. But for now, let that image of a young Kim staring intently from a frosty copse linger in your mind. The flag was red, the star five-pointed, and the hammer and sickle stitched with symbolism. On September 9, 1948, Kim Il-sung stood before a roaring crowd in Pyongyang and declared the birth of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The cheering was thunderous, rehearsed, and echoed through the streets like a drum roll for destiny. At 36 years old, Kim had arrived not just as a leader, but as the architect of a brand new nation. With the Soviet army mostly withdrawn, and the American-backed Republic of Korea entrenched in the south, the peninsula's division was no longer provisional. It had calcified. Both sides claimed legitimacy. Both prepared for a reckoning. But before confrontation came consolidation. Kim's first move as head of state was to shape North Korea's identity into something both revolutionary and distinctly Korean. He called for land reform, socialist unity, and class struggle. Of course, but layered within the Marxist rhetoric was something more local, more emotional, national dignity. It was a potent cocktail freedom from Japanese colonialism, rejection of foreign influence, and the promise of collective strength under a Korean banner. To implement these sweeping visions, Kim wielded a potent mix of ideology and bureaucracy. He leaned heavily on the Korean Workers' Party, expanding it into a tool of control that penetrated every layer of society. Your boss at the factory? Party member. Your child's teacher? Party member. The guy who ran the corner rice shop and asked if you'd read the latest Kim speech? Definitely party member. There were no sidelines in Kim's Korea. You were either on board or under suspicion. And as for those who weren't on board, the purges began early. Political rivals, especially those with ties to the South, or those who had studied in China or the West, were branded factionalists. Some were removed quietly, with vague announcements about reassignments. Others vanished entirely. One day a neighbor would host a dinner. The next day their house stood empty, their windows dark, their children enrolled in different schools if they were lucky. Soviet advisors, too, found their influence shrinking. Kim listened respectfully, but began making independent decisions. He appointed loyalists to key ministries, most of whom owed their rise not to ideology, but to personal fealty. Those who had fought with him in the Manchurian guerrilla campaigns were rewarded handsomely, forming the core of what would become known as the partisan faction. A tight-knit group whose loyalty was forged in freezing hills and shared blood. While purging enemies, Kim also painted dreams. Under his leadership, North Korea initiated sweeping land redistribution. Overnight, the feudal landlord system was dismantled. Roughly 1 million hectares of land were taken from Japanese collaborators and large estate holders and handed to poor peasants. No compensation. Just a firm handshake, a party speech, and a revolutionary banner strung over the nearest barn. For rural families who had toiled under generations of rent and debt, it felt like justice, even if that justice came with a mandatory subscription to the local People's Committee. Urban areas weren't left out. Factories and enterprises were nationalized. Workers were told they now owned the means of production, though in practice, the state did. Still, the narrative was powerful. The age of exploitation was over, and the age of the working class had arrived. Slogans were printed. Loudspeakers crackled at dawn. And across every apartment wall, portraits of Marx, Lenin, and Kim stared down like Holy Trinity icons. Education was overhauled, too. The curriculum emphasized revolutionary history, the evils of Japanese colonialism, and naturally, the greatness of Kim Il-sung. Children were taught that Kim had liberated Korea single-handedly, that he was wise beyond his years, and that he once beat a tiger in hand-to-hand combat. Even religion, long a part of Korean culture, found itself squeezed. Christian churches, Buddhist temples, and shamanic shrines were either shuttered or co-opted into state-approved cultural centers. Worship of anything other than the party became suspect. After all, why kneel to a statue when you could salute the living leader? And oh, how Kim leaned into that role. His image, once sparse, began to appear in newspapers, school books, posters, and public murals. His speeches were studied, his childhood stories recited. He was not merely the head of government, he was portrayed as the beating heart of the nation. In one early propaganda film, a child weeps after seeing Kim speak, declaring, "I saw the sun today." Subtlety was not a hallmark of North Korean media, but behind the sunlit posters, the machinery of the state kept grinding. Mass mobilizations were launched to rebuild infrastructure, often through unpaid labor. Factories operated around the clock, sometimes with only a single working light bulb between shifts. Hunger wasn't uncommon, especially in rural areas, but complaining was dangerous. A poorly chosen joke or a missing badge of Kim could land you a visit from security agents or worse. And yet somehow, the machine worked. By the late 1940s, Pyongyang had been transformed. From a modest city under Japanese rule, it now boasted grand boulevards, new government buildings, and monuments to revolutionary struggle. Trams clanged past murals. Loudspeakers played revolutionary songs from lampposts. In the capital, at least, the dream felt tangible. But outside the glittering facade, tensions were rising. The South remained defiant, its American-backed government hostile and well-armed. Skirmishes along the border were frequent. Civilians fled across lines, chased by patrols or barbed wire. It was clear to Kim, and perhaps to everyone watching, that a larger confrontation loomed. He began planning, his generals trained and rearmed. Maps were studied, supply chains prepared, and quietly he made his case to Stalin and Mao, seeking their blessing for a full-scale invasion of the South. History doesn't repeat, they say, but sometimes it sure rhymes. Just as the Japanese occupation had ended with a Soviet-backed shift in power, so too would Kim now attempt to reshape the peninsula through force. The North was ready, or so they thought. And on one humid morning in June 1950, tanks rolled south from Pyongyang, their treads tearing across rice fields and border posts alike. War had begun. Not a civil war in the traditional sense, but a collision of ideologies, ambitions, and generations of trauma. But let's hold that thought for a moment. Tonight, we leave Kim Il-sung standing in a tailored Mao suit, flanked by soldiers and saluting from a grand balcony. His country is still young. His cult of personality is just budding. And somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbles like a bad omen. It began at dawn June 25, 1950. The roar of Soviet-made T-34 tanks shattered the silence. Along the 38th parallel, as North Korean forces surged into South Korea. It wasn't a skirmish. It wasn't a border clash. It was a full-scale invasion. And just like that, the Korean peninsula was on fire. Kim Il-sung had gambled big. After months of lobbying Stalin and securing a cautious green light from Mao, he launched what he believed would be a lightning war. His assumption? That South Korea would fold quickly under pressure, the people would welcome reunification, and the Americans still licking their wounds from World War II would stay out of it. Oops. Within days, North Korean troops stormed Seoul. The South Korean army was caught off guard and ill-prepared. Civilians fled in droves. clogging roads with carts, bicycles, and the occasional terrified chicken. Pyongyang declared victory inevitable. Propaganda posters went up overnight, showing Kim Il-sung as a heroic general, sword raised, slicing through imperialism. But the South didn't fall. Not quite. And neither did America stand by. On June 27th, under the banner of the United Nations, the U.S. and other allied nations rushed to South Korea's aid. President Truman framed it as stopping communist expansion, a new front in what would soon be called the Cold War. Within weeks, American troops were landing at Bizon, trying to hold what little ground remained in the far southeast corner of the peninsula. For a while, it looked grim. North Korean forces swept southward like a tide. Seoul was lost. Daejeon fell. By August, only a small perimeter around Bizon remained under South Korean control. But there, the tide paused. Then came a twist no one saw coming. On September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur led a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. It was risky tight tides, narrow approaches, but it worked. The surprise was total. North Korean forces, overextended and stunned, began retreating north in chaos. American and South Korean troops surged forward, retaking Seoul and pushing Kim's army back toward the 38th parallel. For Kim, it was a nightmare. His vision of swift unification shattered. His capital was now in range of enemy artillery. He turned to Stalin and Mao, pleading for help. Stalin hesitated, wary of a direct conflict with the U.S., but Mao saw the threat differently. A pro-Western Korea on his doorstep? Unacceptable. And so, under the cover of night and snow, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers poured across the Yalu River. In October 1950, as UN forces pushed north past Pyongyang, they met an invisible wall waves of Chinese infantry, chanting, charging, and catching the Allies off guard. What followed was some of the most brutal combat of the 20th century. Trench warfare, frozen mountains, hand-to-hand fighting in the dead of winter. The front lines shifted back and forth like a seesaw soaked in blood. Seoul changed hands 4 times during the war. Civilians suffered terribly bombings, massacres, famine. Families were shattered not just by geography, but by ideology. One brother, a communist soldier, another fighting for the South. The peninsula bled. By mid-1951, both sides realized no one was winning, but neither wanted to be the first to blink. Peace talks began in July 1951, but dragged on for 2 more agonizing years. The main sticking point? Prisoners of war. The North demanded forced repatriation. The South and its allies refused. During that time, the war ground on soldiers fought and died for territory that would soon be ceded in diplomacy. It was trench warfare, not unlike World War I, with mud, rats, and mortar. Kim, meanwhile, was struggling behind the curtain. The war had gutted his economy and shaken his aura of invincibility. But he adapted. He doubled down on internal control, purging generals who questioned the war, accusing them of cowardice or treachery. He blamed the Americans, of course, but also cast a suspicious eye at anyone who had been too friendly with Soviet or Chinese advisors. It was as much a war for survival as it was for ideology. Then finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. Not a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. The Korean War technically never ended, and the 38th parallel was restored, now lined with a demilitarized zone, bristling with landmines, bunkers, and watchtowers. Over 4 million people had died or gone missing, and the land was in ruins. For Kim Il-sung, it was both a disaster and a reset button. The North had failed to reunify Korea by force. But Kim had survived, and in his survival, he found something priceless: a narrative. He began to recast the war not as a failure, but as a heroic stand against American imperialism. Propaganda films depicted North Korean soldiers holding back waves of U.S. invaders. Kim was now the hero who defeated the Yankees. It didn't matter that Pyongyang had been leveled, or that millions were dead. The story was now one of resilience, of triumph through struggle, of the North standing alone against the world and emerging proud. The war also gave Kim justification for even tighter control. Surveillance increased. The secret police known as the Boibu expanded their reach. Enemy sympathizers were rooted out. Informants were everywhere. Even children were encouraged to report their parents for counter-revolutionary thinking. It was like living inside a whisper. No thought was truly private anymore. Economically, the nation was in tatters. Infrastructure had been destroyed. Entire cities needed rebuilding. And so, Kim turned to the Soviets and Chinese once again, playing them off each other to secure aid and support. It was a delicate dance, but he managed it skillfully, extracting loans, advisors, and construction assistance while insisting on North Korea's independence. He would soon call it Jucky, a word we'll hear again. And even as the fields were still being cleared of landmines, the next campaign was already underway, the ideological rebuilding of the North Korean soul. Kim framed the war as a crucible that had forged a stronger, purer Korea. He launched massive reconstruction campaigns. Statues went up, schools reopened with new curriculums, and everywhere on walls, in music, in children's rhymes, was the message: trust in the great leader. He alone had weathered the storm. So as the smoke cleared from one of the 20th century's most devastating wars, Kim Il-sung didn't retreat or falter. He doubled down. He took the ashes and molded them into a story that would become the foundation of a nation built not just on steel and slogans, but on the belief that to live was to obey, and to obey was to survive. Next, we'll follow Kim's post-war efforts to rebuild his country from rubble, ushering in an era of Soviet-style planning, mass mobilization, and a new ideology you'll be hearing a lot about: Juk. The dust had barely settled. Pyongyang lay in ruins. Bridges twisted like paperclips, villages flattened into ash. But where most might have seen devastation, Kim Il-sung saw something else, an opportunity to build a new world from scratch. It was 1953, and North Korea, battered and bloodied, was about to enter a period of frantic reconstruction and ideological rebirth. The war hadn't ended in victory, but Kim would make sure it didn't feel like defeat. He needed a vision, something uniquely North Korean, something that couldn't be outsourced to Moscow or Beijing. And so, he gave the people Jucky. Jucky, often translated as self-reliance, became the North Korean state's ideological backbone. At first glance, it sounded like your typical socialist mantra: independence, pride, hard work. But beneath that surface was a far more intricate and self-serving doctrine. Jucky meant that North Korea would follow its own path, free of foreign influence, and centered entirely around the will of one man, Kim Il-sung. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ideology is only powerful if it feeds bellies and rebuilds cities. In the immediate post-war years, Kim launched a series of Soviet-style 5-year plans. The focus? Heavy industry. Cement, steel, coal materials that could rebuild a nation and fortify it against future threats. Massive construction projects filled the air with dust and clamor. Factories, hydroelectric dams, and state farms sprang up. Streets once lined with rubble were paved anew, now wide enough to accommodate parades and military convoys. Women, who had largely been confined to domestic roles before the war, were mobilized en masse. They joined factories, construction crews, and collectives. One state's slogan read, "Let the women build socialism with their delicate but tireless hands," which was, frankly, both progressive and slightly patronizing classic North Korean flavor. These years also saw a fierce emphasis on literacy and education. The goal was total literacy. Every child, every adult, no exceptions. Within a decade, North Korea claimed one of the highest literacy rates in the world. Schools became factories for ideological training, producing generations who could recite Chucky texts as easily as multiplication tables. Children grew up hearing stories of Kim Il-sung's legendary exploits, some historical, many not. Remember that time he supposedly shot down an American plane with a single bullet? Yeah, probably not. But not everything was grand strategy and ideology. On the ground, life was still incredibly hard. Food was rationed. Housing was scarce. People stood in lines that wound around buildings for soap, rice, even basic medicine. Yet public morale, surprisingly, didn't collapse. Why? Partly because dissent was dangerous, but also because Kim provided a sense of purpose. In his carefully curated narrative, they weren't just rebuilding their homes. They were forging the first truly independent Korean nation. Suffering wasn't meaningless. It was patriotic. And the numbers, for a while, supported the story. North Korea's economy, against the odds, rebounded quickly in the late 1950s and early 60s. In fact, for a brief period, it outpaced the South. That's right. There was a time when Pyongyang boasted higher industrial output than Seoul. Apartments were built. Schools opened. Factories churned. If you squinted, it looked like Chucky was working. Of course, the real fuel behind this miracle was foreign aid. The Soviets and Chinese poured in money, machinery, and advisors. But here's the twist. Kim positioned all of that assistance as the result of his diplomatic brilliance, not foreign charity. He wasn't accepting help. He was leading a global socialist alliance. A small trick of narrative that, like so many things in North Korea, hid a deeper dependency. The leader also made sure to cultivate the image of a humble servant. He toured factories with his sleeves rolled up, gave rousing speeches in farmers' fields, and posed with children clutching bouquets and plastic flowers. The people, carefully selected for loyalty, clapped and cried on cue. In every village, his portrait began appearing alongside the national flag. And not just in government buildings, homes, schools, even chicken coops. Some unlucky soul once forgot to dust his photo before a house inspection, and, well, they weren't seen for a while. This expanding cult of personality was not just tolerated, it was expected. Officials competed to show the most extravagant loyalty. One provincial administrator reportedly built a 12-meter-high mosaic of Kim's face out of rice grains. It didn't last through the monsoon season, but the point was made. But even as the applause grew louder, Kim faced deeper challenges behind the curtain. The factionalists, remember them? Were not entirely gone. Several rival camps remained inside the Korean Workers' Party, including those loyal to the Soviets and the Chinese. Each had its own ideas about policy and ideology, and some quietly questioned whether Chucky was just a fancy excuse for dictatorship. Kim responded with surgical precision. Between 1956 and 1961, he orchestrated a series of purges. In meetings that began with polite clapping and ended in stunned silence, entire party committees were dismissed. Dissenters were accused of dogmatism, foreign influence, or anti-party behavior. Some were exiled to rural farms. Others simply disappeared. By the early 1960s, Kim had removed nearly every potential rival. What remained was a streamlined political machine oiled with loyalty, lubricated with fear. The outside world began to take notice. To many on the far left, Kim was a model, a leader who had resisted imperialism, rebuilt his nation, and charted an independent path. He received delegations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America leaders, eager to learn the Korean way. Pyongyang became a hub for global revolutionaries. Some even returned home with cash, weapons, and a framed photo of Kim. But not everyone was buying the narrative. Inside the country, economic cracks were forming. Agricultural output lagged behind. State quotas became more unrealistic. Workers were punished for missing targets, even when the machines were broken. But public complaint was impossible. The secret police were never far. Families began learning an essential North Korean skill: how to smile without speaking. Yet Kim wasn't finished. In 1961, he established the Korean Workers' Party Youth League, the Red Youth Guards, and the Socialist Women's Union extensions of state power that reached into every age group and profession. Your whole life, from kindergarten to your funeral, now passed through the arms of the party. Your wedding dress might be state-issued, your job assigned. Your child's kindergarten teacher, probably an informer. Still, it all worked for now. Kim had survived war, purged his enemies, and rebuilt a nation into something resembling a working machine. The trains ran on time, the parades were dazzling, and somewhere behind all the spectacle was a man smiling calmly under the glow of torchlight. But as always, the story doesn't end there. Because next, we'll see how the myth of Kim Il-sung expanded even further, and how a simple ID, absolute loyalty to one man, would become North Korea's most defining feature. The billboards showed smiling workers and sunbursts behind Kim Il-sung's face. The radios hummed with ballads about his wisdom. Teachers taught children to say, before anything else, "Thank you, Father Kim." And in homes across North Korea, people bowed daily to his portrait, careful to dust the frame, even if they skipped dinner. The cult of the great leader wasn't just growing. It was blooming into something mythic. By the mid-1960s, Kim Il-sung was no longer just a leader. He was being sculpted quite literally into a godlike figure. His image appeared in mosaics, oil paintings, sculptures, and textbooks. The man who had once hidden from Japanese patrols in the Manchurian forest now had an 18-meter-tall bronze statue of himself gazing over Pyongyang. Eyes firm, arms raised. The eternal overseer. But this wasn't just propaganda. It was a carefully engineered system of power. By making himself the center of the state, Kim erased the need for checks and balances, debate, or even consensus. If the leader said it, it was law. If he dreamed it, it became policy. If he paused mid-sentence, everyone leaned in waiting to know what they believed. Here's the twist. He didn't invent this model. Stalin had done it. Mao perfected it. But where others would later be denounced or toned down, Kim's cult only intensified. After Khrushchev publicly dismantled Stalin's legacy in 1956, many expected Pyongyang to follow suit. Instead, Kim doubled down. He purged pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions, expelling dozens of officials in the years that followed. Revisionism, dogmatism, foreign worship. These were the charges flung at his opponents. But the subtext was always the same: absolute loyalty to the great leader or silence. And silence, in North Korea, was never golden. It was mandatory. New slogans blanketed the country. Our great leader is the son of the 21st century. Let's live the way the leader teaches. People began carrying miniature notebooks to record Kim's quotes as if they were sacred scripture. These were called learning diaries, and you could be punished for showing up at school or work without one. Picture it, a population with millions of handwritten pages about one man's greatness, written under flickering light bulbs or on school steps in sub-zero weather. The state narrative also rewrote Kim's past. His birth was now said to be foretold by birdsong and a double rainbow. His childhood? A saga of wisdom and bravery. At age 5, he supposedly asked his father why Korea wasn't free. At 7, he began studying revolution. At 10, he declared that his life's mission was national liberation. But the cult wasn't just for show. It was a key tool of governance. Officials were promoted based not on skill or experience, but on displays of loyalty. There are reports of factory managers holding Kim Thought recitation contests instead of safety drills. Artists, writers, and musicians churned out endless tributes. One composer famously spent 2 years creating an opera about Kim's teenage years, featuring a scene where he saves an old man's ox from drowning, heroic, and agriculturally responsible. And if you think all this was confined to the capital, think again. The cult spread into every corner of life. In rural villages, officials erected small monuments and loyalty halls where locals could pledge devotion. Farmers began planting rice in formations, spelling out Kim's name when seen from the sky. Children were renamed in honor of his achievements. Some even began greeting each other with phrases like, "May our loyalty to the leader grow strong." And still, it wasn't enough. In 1972, Kim Il-sung took the final step. He became president of North Korean office, created just for him. The new constitution declared him eternal and infallible. His birthday, April 15th, became the most sacred holiday in the calendar, the Day of the Sun. Entire musicals were written about that one date. Gifts were exchanged. Fireworks lit the skies. And every citizen was expected to perform some small act of loyalty, plant a tree, compose a poem, or at the very least, bow in the right direction. The mythology reached its peak in literature. Biographies described him as an immortal flower, a peerless strategist, and my personal favorite, the greatest master of the pen and sword. If he cured hiccups, I wouldn't be surprised. And in the most surreal twist, North Korean textbooks began suggesting he had invented the hamburger. But beneath all the staged adoration was a nation under immense psychological pressure. People whispered in corners, nodded carefully, and adjusted their posture whenever a portrait was nearby. Children learned to scan their parents' expressions for hesitation. Trust was scarce. Every relationship was filtered through fear. Because in Kim's North Korea, even a pause before clapping could mean disloyalty. And still, remarkably, many citizens weren't faking their devotion. After all, when you're raised from birth to believe a man is your savior, your protector, your surrogate father, doubt becomes more painful than belief. Faith, even fabricated, can bring strange comfort. It orders the chaos. International observers, of course, raised eyebrows. But even foreign diplomats found themselves swept up in the theatrics. Kim was charming, intelligent, and thoroughly rehearsed. He knew how to disarm critics with smiles and how to deliver veiled threats with the same smile still pasted on. And if any were thinking of opposing him, they met an unfortunate fate. Assassination attempts were foiled. Plotters arrested, interrogated, and often never seen again. One attempted coup in the early 1970s, allegedly by military officers wary of the cult, was dismantled in a matter of days. The instigators were publicly shamed, then quietly erased from history. Kim had mastered the delicate art of ruling by both fear and faith. But even he knew that no ruler lasts forever. So behind the gilded curtains of his personality cult, plans were already in motion to prepare a successor. A young man with a fondness for cinema, a weakness for luxury, and a mind trained in the mechanics of propaganda. His name? Kim Jong-il. We'll meet him soon enough. But first, we'll explore how Kim Il-sung expanded his control, not just with words and statues, but with something far more intrusive. A revolutionary caste system, productivity drives, and the foundations of a deeply surveilled society. Because if the cult was the velvet glove, what came next was the iron fist. The factories roared, the parades marched, and the portraits of Kim Il-sung smiled down from every wall. But behind the staged unity of North Korea was a quietly terrifying system. It didn't wear a uniform or carry a gun, but it controlled your job, your food, your future, even your children's marriages. Welcome to the Songbun system, North Korea's invisible caste ladder. While the cult of personality was the public face of Kim Il-sung's regime, Songbun was its skeleton. It classified every citizen into a rigid social hierarchy based on family background, political loyalty, and perceived usefulness to the regime. And it ran deep. How deep? Let's say your grandfather was a farmer who cooperated with land. Reforms after the war. Good. That might place your family in the core class. But oh, if your great-uncle fled to South Korea in the 1950s, suddenly you might drop to the wavering class. Worse still, if a cousin was caught listening to a South Korean radio broadcast, down to the hostile class you go. And once your songbun was tainted, it followed your children, and their children, and theirs. At its heart, songbun wasn't just about control. It was about predictive loyalty. The regime believed that by labeling people early by blood, by guilt, by association, it could prevent future disobedience. Paranoia bureaucratized. This stratification determined everything. The type of school you could attend, your military placement, your access to medicine, even whether you got to live in Pyongyang or some frostbitten village on the northern edge. If you were in the Corps, you might attend elite universities and have indoor plumbing. If you were in the hostel, you might be working a coal mine at 14. And don't even think about marrying up. Marriage applications required songbun background checks. A romance between a wavering and a core citizen? Unlikely. Risky? Often forbidden. It was love, North Korean style, just with more paperwork and fewer candlelit dinners. But while the songbun system sorted the population like a spreadsheet from dystopia, another massive force surged through the country, the Chalama movement. Named after a mythical winged horse that could travel thousands of miles in a single day, Chalama was Kim Il-sung's call for nationwide hyperproductivity. Think of it like North Korea's version of a Red Bull-fueled sprint through industrialization. Workers were told to do the impossible. Triple output, meet quotas weeks early, invent faster methods. Factory foremen began awarding Chalama Rider titles to their most zealous employees. Some would hang plaques by their machines. This worker met the 5-year plan in 3 years. Spoiler alert, many didn't. But the illusion mattered more than reality. Of course, when you push humans to move like mythological horses, something's bound to break. Machines failed. Quotas were faked. Safety shortcuts led to accidents. But no one dared complain. To criticize the movement was to criticize the party. To criticize the party was to question Kim Il-sung. And, well, there weren't many second chances after that. Still, Chalama produced something real. A culture of frantic overachievement, fueled by fear and the promise of praise. Streets were renamed after model workers. Entire districts were honored for breaking records. Newspapers ran daily articles glorifying tireless laborers and denouncing lazy elements. And yet, despite the strain, this campaign gave people something rare in a tightly controlled society. A way to shine. If you couldn't rise by class, maybe you could rise by effort. Some genuinely believed in it. Others pretended to. But either way, the machine kept turning. And it wasn't limited to men. Women, too, were swept into productivity drives. They staffed textile mills, agricultural teams, and light industry workshops. In propaganda posters, they stood tall with hammers and sickles, sleeves rolled and gazes fixed. The image, strong, loyal, revolutionary. The reality, long hours, little pay, and the double burden of work and domestic life. Children were also folded into the rhythm of productivity. School kids practiced military drills, cleaned streets, and planted rice. Every child was part of the Korean Children's Union, reciting daily pledges and wearing bright red scarves. "We are Kim Il-sung's sons and daughters," they chanted. "We follow only the party," and the party watched them back. Because in North Korea, nothing escaped scrutiny. Not your labor, not your lineage, not your thoughts. Local in Minbin neighborhood units small, Block-level surveillance groups monitored residents constantly. They reported on who skipped meetings, who slacked at work, who didn't cheer loud enough at rallies. Your neighbor might be watching you. Your child might be too. One man forgot to take off his cap during the national anthem. Within hours, he was reported, interrogated, and reassigned to hard labor. The cap? It was windblown? The punishment? Not negotiable. Kim Il-sung once declared that every citizen is a cell of the nation. It sounded poetic, but in practice, it meant that any cell could be examined, judged, and removed. The country wasn't just a government, it was a living organism. And Kim was the brain, the spine, and the heartbeat all at once. All of this, the Songbun system, the Cholima campaign, the constant vigilance, might sound suffocating. And it was. But to many North Koreans, especially those in higher classes, it also felt structured, predictable, safe even if you followed the rules. You knew where you stood. You knew what was expected. And as long as you didn't ask too many questions, life could go on. You could attend mass dances in Kim Il-sung Square. You could sing revolutionary songs with your neighbors. You could visit the Grand People's Study House and borrow a book. Just make sure it was the right kind of book. Meanwhile, the world outside began to notice something peculiar. How eerily clean Pyong was. Streets swept daily. Citizens in uniform lines. Traffic controllers performing synchronized gestures. It looked, to foreign visitors, like utopia. But that was just the stage. Behind the clean streets were the camps. Behind the songs were the silences. And behind every statue stood the unspoken truth. Everything you had could be taken in an instant. In the next chapter, we'll follow that shadow. Because when fear becomes a system, it leaves a trail, and we're heading next into the dark world of North Korea's labor camps. Imagine a place where the barbed wire hums under the moonlight and dormitories stand like silent witnesses to lives interrupted. These aren't just prisons. They're islands of despair scattered across the mountains and valleys of North Korea. Welcome to the Kwanliso, labor re-education camps where hostile elements are reshaped by grueling toil, isolation, and the ever-present cold stare of unseen guards. The seeds of this system were sown early, as Kim Il-sung tightened his grip. By the late 1950s, anyone tainted by bad origins landlords, former Japanese collaborators, or relatives of defectors could vanish at night. No trial, no appeal. The security apparatus didn't need evidence. Guilt by association was enough. If your cousin once tuned a radio to Seoul, your family papers might be stamped class hostile and your future sealed. Journeying to a Kwanliso was its own nightmare. Prisoners were crammed into cattle cars, windows barred and sealed, breathing recycled air for days. Guards hurled assigned numbers instead of names, erasing identities with each chain and padlock. When the train screeched to a halt, survivors disembarked into a landscape of barren fields or steep hills areas too remote to serve any other purpose than to hide human suffering. Once inside, the daily rhythm was simple and merciless. Wake before dawn, march to work in sub-zero chill, toil in mines or logging camps until dusk, then trudge back under guard to damp barracks. Food was meager, so little that you could almost taste the emptiness of your stomach. Many prisoners survived on roots, grass, or the occasional scrap of foxing of protein that kept bodies alive but spirits waning. But famine and cold weren't the worst. It was the silence. Conversations were whispered, quickly stifled by echoes of heavy boots. Prayers weren't allowed. Hope, even more dangerous, was unspoken. Every eye was vigilant. Every movement could be reported. In one camp, the chain of command was razor thin. An inmate might snitch on another for an extra scrap of rice, hoping that loyalty to the state would earn a few more mouthfuls. Medical care? A cruel joke. Infected wounds festered. Scurvy and dysentery claimed many lives. Doctors, if you could call them that, made rounds swiftly anointing the dying with injections one day and prescribing silence the next. Corpses were hauled away in the night, names forgotten, numbers recycled for new arrivals. But what truly terrifies about these camps is their purpose: re-education. Each dawn began with political lectures, crammed into freezing rooms where prisoners recited oaths, denounced capitalist conspiracies, and pledged loyalty to the party line. Resist, and the consequences were swift: beatings, reduction in rations, solitary confinement in ice-cold cells, sometimes called tiger cages, where you sat motionless in darkness for days. Yet the party claimed success. Official reports boasted of rehabilitated inmates who returned to society grateful and ideologically pure. Outside propaganda framed the camps as schools of labor and love, where misguided souls found their true purpose. In reality, very few emerged, and those who did were shadows, haunted by the echo of clanging doors and the memory of endless rows of bowed heads. Resistance existed, always fragile, but it flickered. A whispered poem smuggled under a floorboard. A swap of bread between cellmates. These small rebellions cost lives, but they demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit aches for freedom. In one tale smuggled out decades later, a group of prisoners sang quietly at sunrise, a forbidden hymn of longing for home. The guards shut it down, but the song lived on in memories. To the rest of North Korea, the camps were invisible. Families simply heard that a relative had been arrested, then eventually assumed they were lost for the revolution. No one asked questions. No one dared. The government tightly controlled information. Even the phrase labor camp was taboo. Officially, they were revolutionary processing centers, language meant to hide horror behind euphemism. Yet whispers reached foreign embassies and NGOs. Satellite photos revealed sprawling complexes where once only forests stood. Testimonies by escapees painted a picture of a system designed to crush dissent and polish loyalty through misery. It was state terror refined into a bureaucratic routine. And still, in this dark chapter, Kim Il-sung's strategy was clear. Fear and obedience must be inseparable. If you knew the camps awaited you for a misstep, you bent toward loyalty. If you believed your family could vanish next, you cheered the leader's image with more vigor. The camps were a message carved into flesh. Defy, and you disappear. By the 1970s, estimates suggested hundreds of thousands, perhaps, more languished in these gulag-like holdings. The system was self-perpetuating. As long as the regime needed an enemy, the camps needed inmates. North Korea became a country where silence, above all, was silver, but speech cost you everything. And yet, behind the barbed wire and watchtowers, life continued. A mother might sing lullabies to her child born in a camp hospital. A prisoner might pray silently that one day, beyond the fences, there is rice steam and warm sunlight. The human heart, astonishingly, holds on to hope even when all around it preaches despair. Tonight, let that image linger. Distant mountains hiding cages of steel, voices reduced to numbers, and hearts that beat defiantly in the dark. And remember, as always, that history is shaped not just by grand speeches and parades, but by the quiet endurance of those who suffer in silence. The sun never truly sets over the Korean peninsula, not with the DMZ lit up like a Christmas tree strung with barbed wire. It buzzes with tension, even in silence. But in the late 1960s, that silence shattered, because Kim Il-sung wasn't done testing the South or the world. The battlefield shifted from full-blown war to sharp, covert jabs, and the border, already fragile, became an invisible fuse. It started small. Gunfire at the 38th parallel. Patrols vanishing. Landmines where there weren't any the day before. Then, in January 1968, North Korea made a dramatic move. A team of 31 elite commandos slipped into the south, dressed in South Korean army uniforms, armed and silent. Their target? The Blue House, the presidential residence in Seoul. Their mission was bold: assassinate President Park Chung-hee and ignite chaos. But just 2 kilometers from their destination, a local police officer became suspicious. The confrontation escalated, gunfire rang out, and the operation unraveled. 29 were killed, 1 captured, and 1 managed to flee back north. The Blue House raid, as it came to be known, marked one of the boldest attempts at political decapitation in modern history. Kim Il-sung denied direct involvement, of course. But in Pyongyang, the captured commando was declared a national hero, paraded for bravery. For Kim, it was a message to the South: we're watching, and we're not finished. That same month, just as South Korea was still reeling from the Blue House attack, the U.S. Navy intelligence ship USS Pueblo was seized in international waters by North Korean patrol boats. 1 sailor was killed, and 82 others were taken prisoner. Kim accused the ship of spying. Washington denied it, though. Truth be told, the Pueblo was gathering intel, just not inside North Korean waters. The world braced for war. The Vietnam conflict was raging, and now the U.S. faced a new flashpoint. But instead of escalation, a strange dance unfolded. For nearly a year, the crew was held captive, beaten, paraded for propaganda, and forced to sign confessions under duress, some of which they cheekily filled with hidden sarcasm. One statement even ended with a line full of linguistic puns mocking their captors. Bold? Yes. Dangerous? Absolutely. Eventually, in December 1968, after 11 tense months, the U.S. issued a formal apology, later retracted, and the crew was released. The Pueblo remains in Pyongyang to this day, moored on display like a war trophy, a reminder to visitors that North Korea doesn't forget. That wasn't the end of the tension. Throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, North Korea increased cross-border incursions. Small units slipped through the DMZ under cover of night, laying ambushes, sabotaging outposts, and targeting South Korean soldiers. The border was like a frayed wire, always one spark away from lighting the whole peninsula again. Why was Kim doing this? Part of it was strategic. He saw a divided South, distracted by political unrest and U.S. entanglement in Vietnam. Part of it was psychological, an effort to destabilize, provoke, and remind the South who had the initiative. But another layer was deeply personal. Kim couldn't accept a thriving South Korea. The longer the South flourished under capitalism, the more it threatened his legitimacy. So while North Korea built statues, South Korea built factories. While Kim handed out medals, the South was importing color televisions and exporting Hyundai sedans. That ideological imbalance had to be challenged, even if only symbolically. To distract from this gap, Kim leaned even harder into revolutionary theater. The military grew larger, more visible. Massive rallies filled the streets. Soldiers goose-stepped in formation, rifles gleaming under banners that read, "Death to American Imperialism." And always, looming above the crowd, were colossal portraits of the great leader, eyes fixed on a future only he could see. Meanwhile, North Korean textbooks began glorifying these border clashes. Young students were taught about heroic infiltrators who outwitted Yankee puppets. Radio broadcasts blasted across the DMZ, pumping slogans and songs into the South, day and night. Pyongyang even created a special broadcasting troupe, Voice of National Salvation, that used defectors to sow doubt among South Korean listeners. Then there were the tunnels. Throughout the 1970s, South Korean and U.S. forces discovered underground passages dug beneath the DMZ. These weren't amateur efforts. We're talking wide tunnels big enough to move thousands of troops per hour lined with electricity and rail. One even had a fully stocked barracks. When confronted, North Korea claimed they were just coal mines. The walls? Painted black with soot. Subtle. Why dig tunnels? Because they allowed for a surprise invasion, fast and lethal. At least 4 major tunnels were discovered, though experts suspect there could be dozens more. It was a classic North Korean tactic: deny, deflect, then distract with something even stranger. Speaking of strange, in 1978, South Korean film director Shin Sang-ok and his ex-wife, actress Choi Yoon-hee, were kidnapped in Hong Kong and brought to Pyongyang. Why? Because Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's increasingly powerful son, loved movies. He wanted North Korea to have its own Godzilla-style film industry, and figured why not just borrow some talent. For 8 years, Shin and Choi lived in gilded captivity, directing films under close supervision. Their most famous? Pulgasari, a bizarre Kaiju monster film about a metal-eating creature that seems to critique authoritarianism. Oops, eventually, the pair escaped during a trip to Vienna by faking a bathroom break at a U.S. embassy. But that's a tale for another section. These audacious moves, raids, kidnappings, ship seizures, weren't just geopolitical stunts. They were signals. Kim Il-sung wanted the world, especially the South, to know that North Korea wouldn't fade quietly into the background. If the Cold War had front lines, then the Korean Peninsula was the loudest and weirdest of them all. And all the while, the people inside North Korea remained tightly bound by surveillance, scarcity, and ceremony. They built more monuments, memorized more slogans, clapped longer at every speech. Because while soldiers fought on the border, citizens fought a different war. One for survival under a regime that demanded absolute devotion, even as the world watched from a cautious distance. In the next chapter, a single tree almost starts World War III, and what followed was one of the most surreal military standoffs in modern history. Sometimes, wars don't begin with bombs or bullets, but with a tree. It was August 18, 1976, and the weather near the Joint Security Area at Panmunjom was hot, heavy with the weight of summer tension. American and South Korean forces, who jointly patrolled the narrow strip of land where North and South technically remain at war, were given a simple task: trim a poplar tree. The tree had grown large, obstructing the view between 2 outposts and making it harder to maintain line of sight. It was, quite literally, a hazard. But in North Korea, even trees become political. As a U.S. work detail, 2 officers and several South Korean and American soldiers approached the tree. They were watched. North Korean troops, always present in the area, began gathering. At first, they just stared. Then, as the Americans began sawing branches, a group of North Korean soldiers, led by a man named Lieutenant Pak Chul, crossed into the shared zone. They shouted demands: stop cutting the tree. The Americans, sticking to protocol, refused. What happened next would shock the world. Suddenly, North Korean soldiers attacked using axes, clubs, and fists. In less than a minute, 2 American officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, were brutally beaten to death. The others retreated, stunned, bloodied. The North Koreans dragged Barrett's body and dumped it later near the base of the tree, as if to drive home the point. North Korean state media called it an act of self-defense against U.S. aggression. But there were witnesses, photographs, and this time, the U.S. wasn't going to settle for silence. 3 days later, the United States launched Operation Paul Bunyan, a name that, admittedly, sounds more like a logging company than a military action. But don't be fooled. It was one of the most muscular displays of military readiness in peacetime history. Before sunrise on August 21st, a convoy of South Korean and American troops returned to the site. This time, they brought chainsaws, not axes, and several platoons of heavily armed soldiers. Attack helicopters hovered above. B-52 bombers flew overhead, escorted by F-4 Phantom jets. An aircraft carrier battle group moved into nearby waters. And on the ground, special forces with Claymore mines strapped to their chests. Yes, On their chest stood ready the message: you touch one leaf, and the sky falls. And yet, in the midst of this orchestrated fury, they simply cut down the tree. It took 42 minutes. No shots fired. No soldiers crossed the line. Just a well-coordinated show of force that said, "We're not here to fight, but don't try us again." The North Koreans, for once, went quiet. Kim Il-sung issued an unusual statement expressing regret, rare, coded diplomatic language, suggesting he knew this one had crossed a line. North Korean forces stood down, and the tension, though not resolved, cooled for a while. So why does a tree matter so much? Because it showed the world just how hair-trigger the Korean peninsula had become. That even an overgrown branch could spark military escalation. That gestures, symbolic, small and strange, were the currency of power in this frozen conflict. And beneath that, there was something more personal. Kim Il-sung had built a regime around never showing weakness. Every act of defiance, no matter how minor, had to be countered with drama. Control wasn't just a policy, it was performance art. But this time, the stage lights were too bright, and the audience too large. He backed down. Still, it didn't soften the North's posture. In the years that followed, North Korea continued to provoke. Gunfire exchanges flared up across the DMZ. Spy submarines were caught sneaking into the south. Assassination plots resurfaced. And military parades in Pyongyang grew ever more elaborate, showcasing rockets on giant flatbed trucks, even if some were plywood mock-ups painted with shiny decals. Meanwhile, inside North Korea, the regime was shifting again, this time toward quiet succession. Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, was now emerging from the shadows. He had never fought in the war. He wasn't a general, but he had a different skill. He understood spectacle. The younger Kim was an avid film buff, obsessed with James Bond and Godzilla, and he understood how to build narrative. He began reshaping propaganda, more color, more symbolism, more emphasis on the eternal genius of the Kim bloodline. He also expanded the intelligence services, deepening surveillance and sharpening North Korea's already brutal spy network. Kidnappings, wiretaps, double agents all became central tools of statcraft. It was spycraft with a side of ideology. At the same time, Kim Il-sung continued to lead with his signature mix of charisma and iron. He visited factories, handed out on-the-spot guidance, and delivered long, rambling speeches on everything from steel production to revolutionary farming spirit. Citizens listened, not for insight, but for survival. A wrongly interpreted pause in clapping could land you under scrutiny, or worse. Outside, the world changed. The U.S. saw the rise of Carter, then Reagan. The USSR was growing tired. China was shifting toward market reform. But in Pyongyang, time slowed to a halt. The calendar turned, the seasons changed, but the system stayed exactly as it had. One man, one ideology, one all-seeing eye. And the DMZ? Still there, still armed, still humming in the dark. If you ever visit it, and few can, you'll see a line that's less than a foot wide, stretching across the floor of a blue meeting hut. Soldiers from both sides stare at each other in silence. Cameras monitor every blink. Birds fly overhead, oblivious. In the next chapter, we step deeper into succession. Kim Jong-il, the film-loving prince of North Korea, begins rising behind the curtain, but not without orchestrating some of the boldest, deadliest espionage in the country's history. By the early 1980s, the winds inside North Korea began to shift, not with sudden gusts, but with the slow tightening of a curtain behind which a new figure emerged. Kim Jong-il, the son of the great leader, began stepping into view, but not all at once. Oh no, this was no grand announcement. This was a performance. You see, Kim Jong-il had been groomed not like a traditional prince, but like a screenwriter preparing a climax. He understood image, timing, drama. He didn't wear a military uniform yet. He rarely appeared in public yet. But behind the scenes, he was building something even more powerful than an army. A system of narrative control. Born in either 1941 or 1942, his official biography claims a sacred mountaintop birth in 1942, complete with a double rainbow and a new star in the sky. Kim Jong-il grew up in a world of revolutionary myth. His earliest memories weren't just bedtime stories. They were tales of his father fighting imperialism, defeating generals, liberating Korea. Whether they were true mattered less than the fact that everyone believed them. As a young man, Kim Jong-il studied at Kim Il-sung University, focusing on political science. But his passion? Cinema. He adored movies, especially foreign films, which were quietly smuggled in for his private enjoyment. James Bond, Rambo, The Godfather. He loved the thrill, the pacing, the symbolism. He kept a private film archive of over 15,000 titles. But his interest in movies wasn't just hobbyist. It was tactical. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Jong-il was put in charge of the Propaganda and Agitation Department, a core arm of North Korea's ideological machine. Under his watch, state films became more polished, more operatic, and far more centered on the greatness of Kim Il-sung. Characters wept upon hearing his name. Entire plots revolved around his invisible guidance. Even animated cartoons echoed his wisdom. Kim Jong-il believed that ideology wasn't just taught, it was performed. That's why he started personally overseeing the production of plays, operas, and revolutionary cinema. Actors were trained to express loyalty with facial expressions. Camera work emphasized hierarchy-low angles for leaders, high angles for ordinary citizens. Every frame served a purpose. And slowly, without saying it, he made himself indispensable. He established friendships with writers, artists, musicians, then elevated them through loyalty. He reshaped the cultural elite, making sure they owed their success not to talent, but to him. By the late 1970s, Kim Il-sung's aging body began to show cracks. Publicly, he was still vibrant, offering on-the-spot guidance at steel mills and riding tractors for the cameras. But behind closed doors, decisions were increasingly filtered through Jong-il's inner circle. He never called himself heir. That would have seemed vulgar Western. Instead, his image began appearing in state media quietly at first. A photo here, a reference there. Slogans began pairing the great leader and the dear leader. Then came choreographed mass rallies, praising the bright star of Mount Paektu. The code was clear. Kim Jong-il was rising, but not without sharpening the tools of control. During this period, North Korea's spy network expanded dramatically. Kim Jong-il oversaw efforts to kidnap foreign talent directors, chefs, even language tutors. Agents operated across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, gathering intelligence and abducting targets. Their missions weren't always violent, but they were almost always bizarre. One infamous case? A South Korean actress and her ex-husband, a film director, were kidnapped in Hong Kong and brought to Pyongyang to create revolutionary cinema. The actor was forced to remake his past blockbusters under supervision. They even dined with Kim Jong-il himself, who proudly showed off his private cinema and offered notes like a seasoned producer. Eventually, the couple escaped while on a trip abroad, but the message had been sent. North Korea would go to outrageous lengths to build not just a nuclear program, but a media empire. Back home, citizens saw none of this. To them, Jong-il was the quiet miracle, the second son. Children learned poems about his compassion. Workers pinned his badge beside his father's on their uniforms. The Kim dynasty wasn't just political, it was becoming spiritual, eternal. And it wasn't just about praise. Surveillance expanded under Jong-il's direction. The secret police grew bolder. Informants were rewarded more handsomely. A slight joke, a missed bow, a poorly phrased sentence. These could now be interpreted as anti-Kim sentiment. And under the law of guilt by association, entire families could be punished for a single man's whisper. One woman told of how her son made a sarcastic remark during a school performance. Within a week, their whole family was sent to a remote region. No trial, no paperwork. Just a knock at the door, and silence thereafter. Meanwhile, the military was growing. Kim Jong-il understood that while his father had earned his place through guerrilla war, he would need something more. A show of might. He began promoting generals, expanding nuclear research, and modernizing North Korea's weapons, at least in theory. Many tanks were obsolete. Some rifles dated to the Korean War, but appearances were what mattered. And oh, how he cultivated appearance. Parades grew more elaborate. Fireworks, synchronized dancing, and gigantic human mosaics formed portraits of the Kims visible from the sky. Mass games involving tens of thousands of performers became a kind of national heartbeat. To a visitor, it looked like national pride. To a participant, it was 16-hour rehearsals, physical punishment, and the fear of disappointing the dear leader. Still, it worked. By the early 1980s, no one questioned the succession. Jong-il hadn't been elected. He hadn't been appointed. But everyone knew it was a monarchy without crowns, a stage without scripts. And the audience? An entire country, clapping in rhythm because silence was too dangerous. But Jong-il wasn't done proving himself. Next came a campaign of terror, not inward, but outward. A show of force, aimed at South Korea and the world. In our next chapter, we'll follow North Korea's deadliest acts of international violence bombings, sabotage, and a chilling glimpse at just how far the regime would go to make sure the spotlight stayed on them. The night air smelled of wet asphalt and jasmine when the first bomb exploded. Imagine Pyongyang's careful facade cracking not from protests or famine, but from metal hidden in tea tins detonated thousands of miles away. North Korea wasn't just building walls at home. It was planting seeds of terror around the globe. And its reach went well beyond the DMZ's electric fences. Our story turns international, and it starts in Rangoon, Burma. In October 1983, President Chung Do-won of South Korea was visiting the country for a summit. His motorcade snaked through crowded streets, lined with cheering locals, eager for a glimpse of a leader whose name they barely knew. They waved palm fronds and smiled. Perhaps they thought he was a famous film star, not realizing he was about to be targeted by the world's most secretive regime. Inside Rangoon's embassy complex, North Korean agents had smuggled in explosives disguised as tea chests. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Wait for Chon's arrival, plant the devices, and disappear into the humid night. But intelligence leaks, whether from a rival spy service or an accidental confession, alerted Burmese security. They searched the premises, found the bombs, and disarmed them just hours before the president's arrival. Crisis averted? Not quite. Kim Il-sung, still the supreme conductor of North Korea's Symphony of Shadows, didn't blink. He wanted the job done. A replacement team went to work. On October 9th, as Chun's convoy crawled past the embassy, a massive blast ripped through the ornate gatehouse. Concrete fragments flew like deadly confetti, ripping through uniforms and scattering diplomats into the sticky air. 21 people died, including 4 South Korean cabinet ministers and several Burmese bystanders. President Chun, arriving a few minutes late, escaped unharmed, ironically purified by poor timing. In Pyongyang, there was no apology, no regret. Instead, state media rolled out a parade of silent soldiers, portraits, and veiled threats. The message was clear: cross us, and you pay. Foreign soil offered no sanctuary. Even monks chanting in temple courtyards couldn't block these invisible arrows. If Rangoon was a shot across the bow, the fall of 1987 brought a full broadside flight, KA-L8 158, on November 29th. A Korean Air Boeing took off from Baghdad bound for Seoul, the cabin filled with businessmen, families, and holiday travelers dreaming of home-cooked meals. Among them were two North Korean agents, posing as married tourists. They carried scotch, chocolates, and a plastic bag containing 2 soda bottles rigged as time bombs, simple, effective, almost cartoonishly sinister. Some joked that the plan was as naive as thinking crocodile dung sunscreen would work in Antarctica. Still, the agents were meticulous. They handed over their coats, mingled in the aisle, and set the timers. Then they disembarked in Abu Dhabi, blending into an airport crowd that would never suspect the fleeing duo. 2 hours later, as the plane cruised over the Andaman Sea, the bombs detonated. The fuselage split, and KA-Leet 158 plunged into dark waters. There were no survivors, only scattered debris and grieving headlines that stretched across continents. Families shattered. International outrage ignited. Yet North Korea said nothing, no claims, no denials. Silence, as always, spoke volumes. It took months of international investigation before the link emerged. All roads led back to Pyongyang. The agents left paper trails, coded messages, and even boasted in secret meetings. When finally apprehended by Iraqi authorities, one agent confessed under interrogation, only to die mysteriously in custody, a classic North Korean exit. The other eventually returned home, mingling with crowds like a ghost hidden in plain sight. These attacks weren't random acts of violence. They were strategic strokes in Kim Il-sung's grand painting of fear. They said, "We can reach you anywhere, anytime." They shattered assumptions that geography could shield you. They whispered of a regime so paranoid it would lash out at innocents just to prove a point. Back inside North Korea, citizens heard none of this. Their radios crackled only with state-approved symphonies praising the leader. If they heard rumors, perhaps filtered through Chinese smugglers or whispered by returning delegates, they dismissed them as Western lies. To them, Kim Il-sung was still the benevolent father guiding his children through storms. The blasts in Rangoon, the crash in the Andaman, they were distant thunder, not proof of a tempest he controlled. But around the world, alliances shifted. South Korea fortified its airports. Japan tightened maritime patrols. The United States invoked designations that labeled North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism. Diplomatic talks stalled as distrust grew thicker than Pyongyang's ever-present smog. Yet Kim, ever the strategist, never publicly admitted culpability. He cloaked his hands in silk gloves, masking the brutality beneath. And in doing so, he preserved the myth that North Korea operated above the mud of ordinary politics, at least in its own narrative. Still, every story has its crack. International pressure, combined with shifting Soviet priorities under Gorbachev's reforms, began to isolate North Korea. Aid trickled. Trade slowed. Kim Il-sung, once buoyed by Chinese and Soviet largesse, felt the ground shift beneath his boots. He gave rousing speeches, promised new rockets, and tightened security at home. But the seeds of economic strain were planted. Meanwhile, his son, Kim Jong-il, watched and learned. He saw that terror could achieve what diplomacy could not: instant headlines, shaken governments, and terrified publics. He would remember these lessons when, years later, he scripted his own acts of brinkmanship missile tests, nuclear threats, and digital hacking campaigns. And inside North Korea, the story remained the same. Loyalty above all, fear where obedience falters. Citizens whispered about missing neighbors. They adjusted their learning diaries to include not just quotes about Choki, but coded verses about mysterious flames in distant lands. They clapped harder at parades, just in case someone was watching. Abroad, analysts debated Kim's motives: factional rivalry, a bid for negotiating leverage, or sheer unpredictability. Whatever the reason, one truth shone through. North Korea had become globalized in its violence. It was no longer a hermit kingdom isolated by mountains. It was a ghost ship casting torpedoes into the water without warning. Tonight, let that image linger. Covert agents slipping through airports, bombs ticking in soda bottles, nations recoiling in horror, and a leader watching it all from behind mirrored sunglasses. Because when power is rooted in terror, the world becomes a stage, and every innocent bystander a possible player in a drama you never auditioned for. By the mid-1970s, the steam powering North Korea's ironclad narrative was beginning to sputter. Factories still belched smoke, and military parades dazzled on state television. But behind the grand facades lurked a growing unease. The world was shifting economically, politically, and technologically, and Pyongyang seemed determined to stand still. This was the era when economic stagnation and self-imposed isolation would tighten their grip, squeezing both the nation's ambitions and its people's bellies. Let us start with the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979. When OPEC's price spikes rippled across the globe, few places felt the sting like energy-hungry industrial economies. North Korea, which had modeled itself on Soviet-style heavy industry, found itself suddenly starved of the cheap fuel that powered its steel mills and hydroelectric dams. Factories slowed, trains crawled. Streetlights winked out earlier than usual. Imagine waking each morning not to the hum of machinery, but to eerie silence, except for the ever-present echo of party slogans. Kim Il-sung had a response. Tighten controls and declare that true revolutionaries thrive on sacrifice. Propaganda posters urge citizens to fight the darkness, literally turn off lights, conserve resources, and reuse oil drum scraps for heating. People dutifully burned scrap wood, recycled cardboard, and whispered jokes about collecting the neighbor's cooking oil when no one was looking. Meanwhile, North Korea's foreign debt ballooned. In the 1960s, the regime had borrowed heavily from Moscow and Beijing to fund its grand reconstruction projects. By the late 1970s, those loans came due. Kim Il-sung, ever proud of his Jucky doctrine, refused to admit dependence on foreign creditors. Instead, he stalled repayments, calling them imperialist demands, and sank deeper into arrears. Creditors grumbled, interest piled up, and Pyongyang's reputation for financial reliability turned to ash. Trade with the Soviet bloc, once a lifeline, thinned. The USSR, facing its own economic woes, began favoring clients who paid on time. China, freshly embarked on its own reforms under Deng Xiaoping, opened to Western capital while keeping North Korea at arm's length. The DPRK found itself wedged between two slowing giants, clutching its ideology like a life raft in an ever-shrinking sea of opportunity. At home, people felt the pinch. Shortages of basic goods, fabric, toothpaste, matches became routine. Markets, which had sprung up in the 1960s to supply rare consumer items, shrank under government suspicion. Private traders were accused of speculative profiteering and tossed into labor camps. So the black markets went deeper underground, hidden in basement cellars and behind freezer doors. It was like hide and seek, with your only hope of a warm winter coat. And yet, even as the economy groaned, Pyongyang doubled down on self-reliance. Kim Il-sung declared a new Cholima drive this time, urging breakthroughs in agriculture and technology. Engineers were ordered to invent homegrown computers. Scientists were told to create oil from coal. Farmers were tasked with quadrupling rice yields without fertilizer. It was as if the great leader believed that sheer willpower could bend the laws of physics. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Rice harvests faltered. Cows went hungry. The countryside fell into what would later be called the hidden famine. Officially, the state denied any crisis. Officially, every field was lush, and every child well fed. In practice, families scavenged wild roots, oiled tree bark for broth, and traded precious sewing thread for a handful of grain. Mothers whispered old recipes. If you mix acorn flour with barley, it tastes almost like bread. Almost. In Pyongyang, the elite still dined on better rations, but they too complained quietly. Luxurious apartments had hot water mostly. Elegant restaurants served mutton stews, but shortages meant you needed connections just to make a reservation. Diplomats returning from food aid discussions in the West reported back with whispered apologies. Yes, ration rice, but not here. The city felt like a grand theater with no backstage support spectacular on stage, crumbling behind the curtains. Then came the final blow, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The economic pillar that had propped up North Korea for decades vaporized almost overnight. Fuel shipments ceased. Spare parts vanished. Cash transfers stopped. One day, engineers could fix turbines with Russian components. The next, they scraped metal from decommissioned tanks, if they could find any. Kim Il-sung responded with characteristic defiance. He blamed traitorous rumors of Soviet weakness, boasted of further Jackie purity, and launched yet another national campaign. We will endure the march of hardship. Thus began the arduous march, not the later famine, but the ideological precursor in slogans and slogans. Citizens were told to march together through the storm, and some did believe it would pass quickly. Others, who remembered the 1950s, whispered prayers for outside aid. But as the 1990s dawned, aid trickled in grudgingly from China, from remnant Soviet networks, and from international NGOs sneaking through Liaoning. Still, it wasn't enough to fill collapsing granaries. The system groaned under combined weight, aging infrastructure, chronic shortages, economic isolation, and an ideology that refused to compromise. The rigid Songbun hierarchy froze upward mobility, even as commoners needed every possible handhold to survive. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung, now in his 80s, maintained his daily routine of on-the-spot guidance, tours visiting factories, inspecting farms, and delivering long speeches about national renewal. Observers noted he looked frail but resolute like a mountain tree, bending in the wind but refusing to break. And for many North Koreans, that image was comforting. If the leader endured, so would they. But comfort was in short supply. Schools ran on candlelight. Hospitals recycled needles. Children grew up memorizing not just quotations, but emergency survival techniques. If the power fails, gather kindling. If the food runs out, dig roots. If the trains stop, walk home. Their lessons weren't just ideological, they were practical necessities. Through all of this, the regime's isolation deepened. Satellite dishes already illegal were confiscated. Foreign film smuggling, once tolerated for elites, now met harsher penalties. Internet access? Non-existent. Any outsider who ventured in saw the walls, the guard towers, and heard the silence in people's eyes. The DPRK was truly a hermit kingdom, cut off from both warmth and wind. Yet somehow, the story didn't end. People adapted. Markets mutinied privately. Farmers formed secret cooperatives. Families pooled resources. Networks of solidarity illegal, but life-saving spread beneath the surface. It was a testament that even in isolation and stagnation, human resilience finds a way. But for Kim Il-sung, geopolitical and economic tremors were felt as personal affronts. He doctored his public addresses to promise blossoming prosperity once external enemies were vanquished. He tightened media controls and added more punishments for economic sabotage. And at night, when Pyongyang's street lamps flickered off, he must have envisioned a future where North Korea, having outlasted the old superpowers, would finally stand alone and undefeated. That vision, though, proved as elusive as oil from coal. The world moved on without him. South Korea modernized. China blossomed. Russia staggered, then struggled. But North Korea stood in place. But North Korea stood in place, its wheels spinning without traction, revolutionary ideas colliding with economic reality. Tonight, hold that image. A country where ancient rice paddies meet Soviet-era factories, where towering monuments loom over starving fields, and where an aging leader insists on self-reliance, even as the world's push in every other direction. Because sometimes, the hardest yoke isn't chains or barbed wire, but an idea you can't abandon, even when it breaks your back. In the spring of 1994, a hush fell over Pyongyang streets, heavy as a funeral shroud. Kim Il-sung, the indomitable founder of the DPRK, lay dying. For decades, he had seemed timeless and eternal sun, whose light warmed every corner of his realm. But that April, the sun dimmed. The great leader passed, leaving behind an empire of myth, fear, and isolation. What followed was a trial by fire, known as the Arduous March, and an even more perilous dance at the edge of the nuclear abyss. The Arduous March began long before Kim's final breath. Famine had already stalked the countryside since the early 90s. Crops failed under drought and flooding. Tractors stood idle for lack of fuel. Distribution networks collapsed. Estimates vary, but perhaps up to 3 million North Koreans perished in those years, children with hollow cheeks begging for a sip of water, mothers scouring riverbanks for edible plants, entire villages disappearing beneath waves of hunger. When Kim Il-sung died on July 8, 1994, the state script called for instant mourning, 3 years of official grief, ever-present portraits draped in black ribbons, and daily broadcasts repeating his words of self-reliance. But behind that performance, the regime faced a brutal reckoning. How defeat a nation while its guiding star lay cold? Enter Kim Jong-il, the dear leader-in-waiting, poised to inherit a throne built of brittle ideology and empty granaries. He had trained for this moment in propaganda halls and spy schools, but nothing in his cinematic archive could prepare him for feeding millions. Yet he had a tool few other leaders possessed: nuclear ambition. Since the late 1980s, North Korea had quietly pursued nuclear technology under the guise of peaceful energy research. Reactors and laboratories rose near Yongbyon, guarded by soldiers who saw the cooling towers as symbols of national pride. To Kim Jong-il, nuclear capability offered two intertwined promises: leverage over the outside world, and a psychological reprieve for a dying state. If your enemies feared you enough to negotiate, maybe they'd send the grain you needed. In August 1994, barely a month after his father's funeral, Kim Jong-il hosted high-level talks with visiting U.S. envoys in New York. He pressed his hand in clenched palm and offered assurances. We seek peace and stability, while subtle threats lingered in his eyes. Outside, famine victims scraped the snow for scraps of corn. Inside, the dear leader plotted a new path: nuclear brinkmanship in exchange for survival aid. By 1995, North Korea had openly declared its nuclear facilities. Satellite imagery revealed cooling towers, spent fuel ponds, and reprocessed plutonium. Washington panicked. European capitals buzzed with crisis meetings. Aid organizations braced for an influx of refugees. And Kim Jong-il, ever the showman, stood firm, demanding food, fuel, and recognition as a nuclear state. The resulting negotiations, known as the Agreed Framework, were a tightrope walk. The U.S. and its allies promised heavy fuel oil shipments and frozen reactor construction in exchange for North Korea freezing its nuclear weapons program. For starving families, that oil meant electricity and warmth. For the regime, it meant a lifeline to cling to. Meanwhile, the arduous march ground on. People lined up for meager rations, sometimes a bowl of watery porridge or a handful of corn kernels. Markets, semi-tolerated after 1991, swelled as survival trumped ideology. Farmers sold extra produce for a sack of rice. Vendors hawked wild herbs as medicinal cures. The black market thrived, birthing a new class of traders who navigated the system's cracks. Officially, private commerce was taboo. Unofficially, it became the only economy that mattered. Children born during the famine grew up knowing hunger is normal. They memorized quotes about Chucky alongside survival tips, avoiding conscription by studying in technical schools and trading empty rice bags for second-hand clothes. HIV and tuberculosis, once controlled, re-emerged in cramped quarters. Hospitals operated with primitive supplies, if they operated at all. Amid this suffering, the cult of the Kims remained unblemished on the surface. Portraits hung in every home, and citizens few with meaningful alternatives clung to rituals of loyalty, bowing low, attending mass rallies, and chanting slogans at dawn. In a world turned inside out, rituals provided a fleeting structure. Even children marched in schoolyards, reciting, "We follow the path shown by the general, defended by the dear leader." International aid trickled in, delayed by sanctions and political wrangling. Food convoys stopped at checkpoints. Flour sacks were diverted to the elite. Kim Jong-il oversaw distributions personally, photographed smiling beside grateful villagers' images that masked the reality of hollow fields and empty stomachs. Yet the nuclear standoff endured. In 1998, North Korea launched a long-range missile over Japan and untested, Taepodong-1, that arced into the Pacific Ocean. It was a public display of capability and audacity. South Korea scrambled air defenses. Tokyo grumbled. Pyongyang gloated. For Kim Jong-il, the missile was an encore of the Blue House raid and the Pueblo seizure, authoritarian theater on a global stage. As winter gave way to spring in 1999, the arduous march neared its end, but the wounds lingered. Families torn by hunger slowly knitted themselves back together. Markets became ingrained in daily life, no longer whispered secrets, but accepted realities. Electricity flickered back in some cities. Schools reopened, their corridors filled with the squeak of chalk and the chatter of children, some with shadows beneath their eyes. And through it all, North Korea's leaders remained both architects and actors in a national drama. Reclaim survival through nuclear brinkmanship, maintain cult rituals, and manage hunger with half-promises. The DPRK had weathered storms before, purges, isolation, but the convergence of famine and nuclear threat created a paradoxical fortress, impregnable in its deterrence, but fragile in its foundations. Tonight, let that paradox echo in your mind. A land where people scramble for rice beside towering cooling towers, where smiles mask despair, and where nuclear shadows loom over fields of grain. Because in North Korea, power and deprivation walk hand in hand, and the next act is always a question of when, not if. When Kim Jong-il finally stepped fully into the spotlight in the early 2000s, North Korea was a nation at the edge worn thin by famine, isolated by policy, and tightly clenched by fear. Yet it was also a nation reinventing itself beneath the surface. Quiet black markets flourished, cultural habits shifted, and the son of the great leader was no longer simply the heir apparent. He was now the unquestioned supreme commander of a deeply unpredictable state. Kim's rise had not been sudden. By the time of his father's death in 1994, he had already been calling the shots in media, culture, and security for over a decade. But the transition from dear leader to actual ruler still required a careful campaign. State media rear-end stories of his childhood bravery. Giant murals depicted him alongside his father, whispering sage advice into his ear, even if, chronologically, little Kim would have been 4 years old at the time. But what defined Kim Jong-il's reign was not his charisma, which was slight, or his military experience, which was none. It was his ability to blend menace and myth with modern performance. If Kim Il-sung had been the revolutionary general, Kim Jong-il was the director of the stage play, and North Korea was his set. He doubled down on nuclear weapons development, but even more critically, he allowed, and in some cases quietly encouraged a degree of economic flexibility. After the famine, Pyongyang realized that markets, though dangerous ideologically, were vital practically. The state turned a blind eye to small-scale trade, especially by women, who began running household markets and underground stalls across the countryside. This emerging gray economy fed people more effectively than the government ever could. Barter systems thrived. Traders smuggled Chinese goods across porous borders. Flash drives of forbidden South Korean dramas trickled into villages, showing ordinary people that life beyond the border wasn't filled with misery, but with color, laughter, and K-pop. It was destabilizing in slow motion. The more people saw jeans, cell phones, and rice cookers in South Korean soap operas, the more they understood just how deep their own deprivation went. Still, many reconciled these differences not with rebellion, but with quiet adaptation. In a society where open defiance meant ruin, discretion became the last remaining freedom. Kim Jong-il, paradoxically, permitted just enough dysfunction to prevent implosion. He was deeply aware of how fragile the myth of his father's state had become. So he split his efforts: bolster the military, maintain the cult, and cautiously manage internal chaos. The result? Songun military-first policy. This doctrine elevated the armed forces above all else, both in policy and prestige. Soldiers received first priority for food, resources, and propaganda glory. They were the protectors of Jochi, the guardians of the revolution, and most critically, the shock troops of Kim Jong-il's legitimacy. But even the military wasn't immune to decay. Equipment rusted, fuel stocks dwindled, yet the imagery remained dazzling. Missile parades, goose-stepping units, soldiers with steely stares and bayonets glinting in perfect rhythm. And through it all, the leader high-collared, inscrutable waved from a viewing platform, a living relic from a nation that ran on spectacle. Culturally, North Korea under Kim Jong-il took a stranger turn still. He revived theater and film production, funding revolutionary operas, lavish musicals, and cinema projects that retold Korean history with mythical flourish. In one film, he was portrayed as the reincarnation of a mountain warrior who had slain Japanese generals with his gaze. In another, his voice alone inspired workers to mine an entire mountain in record time. Most citizens watched these not with awe, but with weary routine. The propaganda had become so thick it was almost translucent. But even absurdity couldn't prevent the unexpected: a small tech boom. In the mid-2000s, Pyongyang launched Kwangmyong, a state-controlled intranet. It allowed citizens limited access to curated websites, government encyclopedias, state news, and revolutionary song lyrics. Most homes had no computers, of course, but universities and party officials accessed terminals. Kim Jong-il's regime even developed rudimentary tablets sold as e-readers with political texts hard-coded in. No swiping left, just endless Jochi. Meanwhile, diplomatic attempts at nuclear disarmament sputtered. The 1994 agreed framework collapsed in 2002 amid accusations of uranium enrichment. Kim responded by expelling international inspectors. Then, in October 2006, North Korea conducted its first underground nuclear test. The mountain trembled. The world gasped. The regime smiled. The test was weak by nuclear standards, but the symbolism was atomic. North Korea had officially joined the nuclear club, and suddenly it was no longer a starving rogue nation. It was a starving rogue nation with a bomb. This shifted global calculations. Kim Jong-il understood that with each test, each launch, each act of defiance, the world would respond often with aid, concessions, or negotiations. He played this strategy repeatedly. One week, he'd launch a missile. The next, he'd offer talks. The week after, he'd disappear for 3 days and let the international rumor mill swirl. Was he dead? Was he ill? Was there a coup? Each time, the curtains parted, and he re-emerged limping, smiling, always in control. But beneath the sunglasses and platform shoes, Kim Jong-il was aging. Diabetes, heart disease. In 2008, he reportedly suffered a stroke. Though he reappeared months later, thinner and more subdued, his successor was already being whispered. Kim Jong-un, the third son, Western-educated, untested, but photogenic. It was an eerie repeat of history. By 2010, Kim Jong-il accelerated preparations for transition. Jong-un was awarded military titles, shown at public events, and praised as brilliant. The regime carefully curated images. Jong-un inspecting tanks, studying satellite images, even posing beside generals twice his age. Pyongyang was preparing its next myth. Then, on December 17, 2011, Kim Jong-il died. State television broke the news with a weeping anchor in black. Across the nation, citizens knelt in public squares, sobbing in rehearsed anguish. Outside Pyongyang, many were simply confused. Would the system survive? Would the markets close? Would the lights go out again? But they didn't. At least, not right away. Kim Jong-il's legacy was paradoxical. He had ruled with fear, but permitted cracks. He had wielded terror abroad, but tolerated small freedoms at home. He hadn't solved the country's problems, but he'd kept the illusion alive long enough to pass the burden forward. And so we end the arc of the First Dynasty's second act. The cameras dim, the chorus quiets, the stage clears. The next spotlight will shine on a man with a familiar name, a Swiss education, and a nuclear button close at hand. Now, let's ease the story to a close. So here we are, at the soft landing of a story built on steel, shadows, and silence. We've traveled from the foggy mountain trails of Manchuria to the concrete parade grounds of Pyongyang, watching a family dynasty mold a nation like clay sometimes, sculpted with care, sometimes crushed in a clenched fist. North Korea's history isn't easy. It's sharp-edged. It whispers through barbed fences. It echoes from missile silos, and it flickers in the cold glow of ration-heated kitchens. But even here, perhaps especially here, we find humans trying to survive, trying to believe, trying to hold on to something beneath the weight of so many flags. As we fade from this tale, picture the morning mist curling over a rural North Korean field. A woman opens her window to frozen air. A radio crackles with familiar tunes. Somewhere, a child slips a flash drive into a hidden port and glimpses the world beyond. And across the mountains, a uniformed man salutes a photo, not quite knowing if he believes in it anymore. Let the sounds soften now. The slogans grow quiet. The rockets return to storage. And the portraits, ever smiling, rest in their frames unchanged, untouched, but watched by eyes that, perhaps, no longer see them the same way. Sleep easy, dear listener. The world still turns, even in places where time stands still. And in that turning, there is always the quiet promise that stories, even the hardest ones, are still just that, stories. And stories can change. Good night.